Hello and welcome to the Blue Collar Breakdown. I'm going to have to fix that intro. I called it the Blue Collar Economist podcast because, hey, I'm Tom Eddlem. I'm the Blue Collar Economist. But you know what? There was another guy who created a Blue Collar Economist podcast. And guess what? He did a pretty good job with it. So I'm happy with letting him have it. And even though it's a little inactive, he did a nice job. And so I'm Blue Collar Breakdown. Okay, here's the plan for this podcast. I've got, for this podcast today, I've got Iran, a little bit on immigration, and the introduction. Not necessarily in that order. I want to outline this podcast. My solo podcast, like today, will be limited to about 30 minutes. And the plan is to do it weekly every Wednesday night at 8:30 live. So I'm going to be doing that. You can see I don't have huge tech here or a big studio. Tech upgrades and studio upgrades will be, and also frequency increases will be as I get support from you, the viewers. This is the only time I'm going to promote donations at the beginning of the podcast. At the end, I'm going to have a little trailer where I list my patrons and everything. But this is the only time I'm going to appeal for funds from my viewers. And the irony is, it's probably the podcast that's going to be listened to the least, but that's okay. The format is I will do about a half hour when I'm doing it solo. I have lots of interviews planned, and the interviews will just go as long as they go. The weekly podcast, my commitment to you is to do one a week. I have plenty to say every week. And I have enough to say 3 or 4 times a week, but I don't have the time. I have a full-time job. And when I say I'm a blue collar economist, I'm literally blue collar. Let me give you a little bit back of my background. When I was growing up in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, I'm 59. My parents had 2 expectations of me. 1, that I would go to college, and 2, that while in college, I would work in the trades, which I did as a roofer. And I went to Stonehill College, got my bachelor's in political science and history. And then I went back to work as a roofer briefly, worked for the John Birch Society as their research director throughout the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, and into the early 2000s. And then I got sick of living in Wisconsin. I loved my job there. Moved back to Massachusetts, and my brother, who also both my brothers followed in my parents' recommendations. They both went into the trades while they were in school. One of them decided to start a plastering company, so I learned plastering, and I did that for a little while, and then I became a weekly newspaper editor south of Boston, and then got hired as a teacher at a local Catholic school I taught history and economics for 11 years. And one of the interesting things is I never gave up plastering. I always did it summers and weekends because I worked for a Catholic school and the pay was terrible. I eventually gave up the teaching position because the school was failing, and my youngest of my 3 daughters had graduated. I didn't need the tuition break anymore. And I just thought, well, what am I doing here? I'm not here for this salary. I didn't think I was actually going to be able to teach the kids the way I wanted to if I stayed. And I said, I can make more doing my summer job as a plasterer. And then I thought, I could make more doing my summer job as a plasterer. So I went back to plastering, and it allowed me to go back to school and get my master's degree from Boston College in applied economics. I did that during the COVID era, and here I am. I'm still working as a plasterer, and I do a lot of writing for the Libertarian Institute. I'm the William Norman Grigg Fellow at the Libertarian Institute, and I also write some for the Libertarian Party of Massachusetts on their blog. So there's that. So that's basically who I am. I would ask you to like and subscribe this, even if you can't contribute. But I will have a Buy Me a Coffee link up at the end of this. But the Buy Me a Coffee link is pretty simple. It's it's simply buymeacoffee.com/blue collar economist. And that's me. You'll see my picture. You'll see some of my graphs there. The format for I should say the topic of the podcast is going to be mostly economic because that's my background. However, I'm not going to do that today. So there will be exceptions, but for the most part, I'm not going to focus on foreign policy unless I have a really good foreign policy guest like Scott Horton or Kyle Anzalone. And I do hope to have many of my Libertarian Institute colleagues on the podcast with me over time, especially as I get better at the tech end of things. But my focus will be on economics. And if you read my Libertarian Institute writings, it's mostly economic. And I've got a lot of writing projects related to that upcoming too. So my writing will continue to be focused, even as we head into Armageddon. My writing will continue to be largely focused on economics and not on the foreign policy or social issues. But I'm going to delve into both of those tonight. Okay. So I thought one thing we could do, and my background is political science and history going back to the 80s, and I've followed the Iran-Iraq history throughout my life because everything blew up in 1979. But I've studied Iran over the years, and so I'm going to give you sort of a brief overlook of U.S. relations with Iran going back to the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean from the first real interactions the United States had with Iran all the way up to the present. And it'll be quick. So in World War II, the United States and its OSS, the precursor of the CIA, had a guy in Tehran called Norman Schwarzkopf. That may be a familiar name for you if you're familiar with the Iraq War of 1991. But it's Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., who worked on Iran to make sure that they didn't join the Axis and stayed friendly to the Allies during World War II, and they did. By 1953, Iran had become an incipient parliamentary democracy. They had elected a prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh, and one of the things that Mossadegh wanted to do as a reform was he wanted to renegotiate the terms of Iran's oil deal with British Petroleum. British Petroleum had, because of British colonial power in the neighborhood, they had run Iraq and had substantial influence in Iran. They had this deal where basically British Petroleum got almost all of the proceeds of Iran's oil profits, and the Iranian people got none. So he said, "Oh well, I want to socialize it." Now I'm against socializing things, but clearly British Petroleum was a state actor in the sense that they took advantage of Iran and their politicians and used it to squeeze out Iranian domestic producers, businessmen, or whatever, so that they couldn't have access to any of the business of the funds. Now, what happened was in 1952, 53, British Petroleum was really mad about this. They thought, oh man, socialism is coming to Iran. Now, Mossadegh was he was a socialist, I guess, in the sense that he wanted to nationalize Iran's oil, but he wasn't a communist, and all of history has acknowledged since then that he wasn't a communist. But British Petroleum went to MI6 and said, "What are we going to do? We're going to lose billions of dollars. Can you do a coup?" And the British said that we don't have the capability anymore. So the MI6 dialed up John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA at the time. John Foster Dulles, his brother, was the Secretary of State under the Eisenhower administration, and said, "Can you guys do a coup for us? we think there might be communism in Iran. So the Eisenhower administration, the Dulles brothers, said, yeah, we can do that. And they imposed the Shah Pahlavi, who was a brutal dictator. He deposed Mossadegh, who did remain in like a tiny role, but it was the end of Iranian independence. The Shah was the puppet of the United States and to a certain extent Israel. And for 25 years, the Shah's secret police, the Savak, put everybody that they thought would oppose the Shah into prison, tortured them. There were the terrible torture chambers. So I see all these memes on Facebook with pictures of women with flowing hair and short skirts and saying, oh, before the Iranian Revolution, Iran looked like this. And I suppose to a certain extent they did. But before the Iranian Revolution, there were torture chambers too. And the Iranians really didn't like getting tens of thousands of their citizens killed and tortured by a foreign puppet. And by 1979, they rebelled. They kicked out the Shah, and the Iranian cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been in exile in Paris, returned triumphantly and became basically the leader of the country. They still have an Ayatollah today. It's a different guy. It was Ayatollah Khomeini. Now it's Khamenei. It's a different guy. And the one of the things that happened after the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah was kicked out, is that the U.S. Embassy went into overdrive to see if they could get him put back in. And the CIA officials at the U.S. Embassy started working to create the kind of conditions for another coup. The 1953 coup is absolutely acknowledged historical fact. It was called Operation Ajax by the CIA. And they wanted to do another one in 1979 to reimpose the Shah. And that's what they want to do today. Actually, they want to reimpose the Shah's son in power in Iran. But what the Iranian government did was they had some students revolt and they ransacked the embassy, and that created the hostage crisis. So basically what Iran did when they were faced with a foreign government trying to overturn their government once again and restore a brutal dictator who had killed tens of thousands of their own citizens is they went in and they tried to stop the CIA agents in place at the U.S. Embassy, and they created them, kept them as hostages. They kept them for 444 days, over a year, released them right before Ronald Reagan became president. And Iran also, at that point, started standing up for Palestinian rights, because at that time, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza had no independence from Israel. They were occupied by Israel. They weren't allowed to have elections. They weren't allowed to have independence in any way. They weren't allowed to vote in Israel. They were basically an apartheid state. And Iran started backing militants, there's no other way of putting it, who supported Palestinian independence. And there were a number of different groups they backed. They backed Islamic Jihad. They backed Hezbollah. They backed, I wrote down a couple of them. Oh, the PLO, which today is Fatah. They run the West Bank, which Israel is fine with. And they also eventually, many decades later, I mean, in the early 2000s, they started backing Hamas. Hamas is the political party turned militant group in Gaza, and a little bit more about them later. So the United States immediately, during the hostage crisis, we seized about, I think it was about $50 billion of Iranian assets and kept them. Just kept them. We said we're going to keep these until you improve your relations with the world or whatever. We just stole their things, but we did put them in like an escrow account, and it kept accruing interest, even though it was bad interest. It wasn't even really enough to keep up with inflation, but it by the time President Obama eventually gave it back to them, it was about $200 billion. So anyway, Iran starts backing Palestinian movements, and Israel, of course, doesn't like it. And of course, the United States, during the early Reagan administration, started sending American troops to Lebanon, where many of the Palestinian militants were organizing, especially Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. And what happens is there are a number of bombings of Americans. There was a bombing of the U.S. Embassy, and then a bombing of the Marine Corps barracks, and then another bombing of the U.S. Embassy annex in Lebanon. And Reagan basically said, "Look, I want to get out. I don't want to deal with this kind of Middle Eastern politics, because we're not accomplishing anything." Right? We had shelled a number of militants at that time in the 1980s. Lebanon was gradually changing over from a majority Christian country to a majority Muslim country, and the government at the time was a fascist group that had committed some massacres of Muslims, and of course there were massacres on the other side by Muslims. So it was just brutal fighting in Lebanon. It was chaos, and Reagan just said, "Look, I'm not getting involved in Middle Eastern wars anymore," and he pretty much didn't, except in 1981. I should say in 1980, the Iran-Iraq war started. And it was really kind of at the prompting of the U.S. government. It sort of predates Reagan. And the Iran-Iraq war was a brutal, bloody war. It was, millions of people died, hundreds of thousands on both sides. And keep in mind, these are very populous nations. I mean, Iran has about 90 million people, and Iraq has about half that. So about 40 to 45 million. So they were just throwing soldiers into the mix. And the United States initially was on Saddam Hussein's side, the Iraq side, in the Iran-Iraq war, because we wanted, in America, the Iranians were known as being the bad guys. They were the people who had kept our hostages for 444 days for no reason whatsoever. Of course, they had actually really good reasons for charging the embassy. And then when we grabbed all their assets, they said, "Well, we'll give you the hostages back, when you give us our stuff back." So there was that deal. And then they gave the hostages back, and we didn't give them their stuff back. But the Iran-Iraq war was huge. It went on until 1988. It was really bloody. And that was when Iran actually started a nuclear weapons research program. And Iraq did the same. The Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq war had used chemical weapons against the Iranians. And the Iranians, knowing that Saddam Hussein had a nuclear weapons program, said, "Well, gee, if he gets a nuke, we're sunk. So we've got to get one too." But neither actually ever got to that point during the war. And the war ended in kind of a stalemate. None of the borders changed. They just continued to hate each other for they never made up. And Saddam Hussein, of course, in 1991, the United States invades Iraq because Saddam Hussein had decided to invade another neighbor, Kuwait, which was a very tiny Arab sheikdom. And the United States was going to save democracy by restoring the Kuwait sheiks to power, which we did. And it was an easy war from the standpoint of the military aspect of it. And George Bush Sr., I don't know if it's to his credit, but he realized that getting involved in a long-term war in Iraq was a bad idea. So as soon as Saddam Hussein was pushed out of Kuwait, he pulled his troops out of Iraq, and that was the end of the war. But the United States started imposing all kinds of sanctions and restrictions, especially with regard to Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program. And it was at that point then that Saddam Hussein basically gave up his nuclear weapons program. And the irony is this: he gave up his nuclear weapons program, but he wanted the world to think that he still had one in the 1990s. It doesn't make sense to an American. You think, well, why would he give up a program to develop a nuclear weapon and then want everyone to think so? Well, he wanted to look tough, but he also wanted to show the Americans, hey, I'm not as crazy as you might think. On the sly, I'm not really getting a nuclear weapon. He officially denied it, but he wanted it to look like he was still getting one. So Iran continued with their nuclear weapons research program right up until 2003. Iran didn't get to the nuclear weapons point, to the point where they got a nuclear weapon, but they continued with their research because of the threat of Saddam Hussein. And they kind of believed it because Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons on them. And, it's just, there were terrible relations between Iran and Iraq. Well, 2003 happens. The United States stupidly invades Iraq over weapons of mass destruction, which Saddam Hussein did not have because he had given up his weapons program. And we invade, and a couple of the diehard neocons say, "Oh, we found some nuclear or some biological stuff in the back of a refrigerator that he forgot about, or an old chemical artillery shell from the Iran-Iraq war that they forgot to destroy." But there were no weapons of mass destruction that we found. Saddam Hussein had given up his weapons of mass destruction program, and that's what happened with Iran. Iran gave it up in 2003 because they said, okay, well, we were concerned about Iraq getting a nuclear weapon and bombing us, but it's pretty clear they're not going to get one now that the United States has invaded. So they gave up their program and just decided to keep going with the nuclear energy and nuclear energy research because, well, we got this far with it, might as well get some civilian benefit out of it. And let me see, where am I in the timeline here? My notes. Okay, by 2015, there was some concern by the neocons. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu has been saying that Iran is close to a nuclear weapon since the early 1980s. It wasn't true then. By 2003, it might have been, but Iran had basically given it up. But, by 2015, there was enough, how do I put it? There was enough concern among the neocons. They made a big enough stink about it. And certainly from the Israelis that, hey, something had to be done about Iran's nuclear program. Again, I'm back at the Iran with an N, not Iraq with a Q. So they came to an agreement. Several nations, Britain, Germany, United States, Iran, a couple others, got together and created what was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. And basically what it was is Iran agreed, look, we're going to do a nuclear energy program. If you want, we'll have France enrich our nuclear energy. Just give us the 3% back, and we'll run nuclear power plants. That's fine with us. We want nuclear energy, and you can inspect our nuclear energy plants. And by all accounts, Iran was keeping to the commitments. when in 2017 or 2018, Donald Trump just unilaterally pulled out of the JCPOA accords. And for a while, Iran kept to most of the requirements of it. Iran decided right about that time, and Scott Horton has been pretty good about explaining this, is that what Iran wants is, especially with all of the bellicosity coming from Israel. Israel is, there's no love lost between Iran's leaders and Israel's leaders. The people may be another issue. And so Iran decided, look, it'd be nice to have what we might call a latent nuclear threat. Let's enrich uranium higher than we need to for nuclear energy, but lower than we need for a nuclear weapon. Basically, what we're going to do is we can show we can make a nuclear weapon, but we're not going to. And what happened was the Ayatollah Khamenei, the new Ayatollah, the one, because the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, he died in 1989. The new guy came in and he issued a fatwa against no nuclear weapons production. And it's interesting because in the recent assassinations by Israeli officials of generals and whatever, they've killed almost everybody but Khamenei. And that may be because he's the last break on nuclear weapons production. I mean, let's face it, when generals are faced with the option of should we have nuclear weapons or should we not have nuclear weapons, they always want nuclear weapons. When they're faced with should we escalate or not escalate, they always want to escalate. If you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides, the generals, were universally telling the president and the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev, we can't back down. We have to go full in on this. It doesn't matter whether it's Curtis LeMay telling John F. Kennedy, hey, we can win this war. If they go nuclear, we can still win it. Or the Russian general staff telling Khrushchev, we're not going to back down. We can win this war, even if it goes nuclear. That's just the way generals are. And it's the same in Iran, just as it is in the United States, right? All the generals are saying, go, go, go in America today. Go after Iran. Well, all the generals are probably saying the same thing to the Iranian political leaders, and Khamenei has been the brake on it. But anyway, the Iran continued to comply, at least in part, to the JCPOA accords, even though the United States had pulled out. But by 2023, so 2 years ago, the whole thing just blew apart because Iran basically said, why bother? If Iran, if we're not getting an agreement, why should we as a sovereign nation do what another country says we should do? Why? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So Iran stopped bothering to comply. Now, here's the interesting part. All of the intelligence agencies have all along concluded, now it doesn't matter whether it's Mossad or the CIA or the DNI or whatever, they've all concluded Iran has not sought a nuclear weapon. Now, if you look at the public pronouncements of the different politicians, what they say is Iran is close to a nuclear weapon. And that's true because that has been Iran's program, to be close to a nuclear weapon and stay close to a nuclear weapon, just like Brazil and Germany and a number of Japan, a number of other countries that basically have said, look, we can make a nuclear bomb, but we don't need to. And, if we run into a threat, we might, but there's no reason to do it. That's basically Iran's position and has been since 2003. And all of the intelligence agencies, the Mossad, there were leaked Mossad documents that came out in 2015 that said Iran's not seeking a nuclear weapon. And Mossad has not come out publicly and said that they are seeking a nuclear weapon since then. Now, Bibi Netanyahu in 2015 was saying actually he testified before Congress saying Iran is actively seeking a nuclear bomb and could have one within, I believe he said months. But that was not true. And at the time, the CIA and the DNI had said, the Director of National Intelligence had said, no. There's no attempt by Iran to get a nuclear bomb, nor is, and that was the intent by Tulsi Gabbard, not the intent, the statement by Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, back in March and in April, and she still has that opinion that Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon. And the interesting thing is, asked by a reporter just yesterday, Donald Trump said, I don't care what she says. You see, this war has nothing to do with the Iranian nuclear threat, because everybody from the Mossad to the CIA to the DNI, the NSA, the DNI, everybody knows Iran is not a nuclear threat. It's certainly not a threat to the United States. They have no way to deliver it to the United States. There's no way. This is about regime change. That's why, even though Bibi Netanyahu accused Iran of trying to assassinate President Trump twice with no evidence whatsoever, of course, it's absolutely fictitious. Iran, the Israelis are the ones actually assassinating. They've bragged about it. Oh, we went after the scientists. We went after the generals. We're doing. We're chopping the head off the snake. We're targeting all of the top political officials because we want regime change. That's what this war is about. And just like with Saddam Hussein in 2003, they're selling the war because they poll tested it. In 2003, they poll tested. Actually, it was in 2002 they poll tested it. They poll tested, how do we sell the American people on this war with Iraq against Saddam Hussein, because they wanted to regime change him for Israel. And the poll came back and said, well, if there's a nuclear threat, we can do it. So they sold it with Condoleezza Rice going on CNN and saying, hey, we can't take the chance because the next warning could be a mushroom cloud over Washington or New York or Los Angeles. And all of the different neocon apparatchiks, all the different tools of the military industrial complex came out and said, he's got a nuclear program and it's a big threat and we can't take the chance. But they all knew they were lying. They all knew they were lying in 2002 and 3. And they all know they're lying in 2025 about Iran. Because Iran is not seeking that nuclear weapon. Now, I don't know. You start assassinating all the people in the leadership, and Iran might say, Libya gave up their nuclear weapons program and pledged never to have nuclear weapons, and North Korea didn't and developed nuclear weapons. And look what happened to the leader of Libya, and look what happened to the leaders of North Korea. The country with nuclear weapons, nothing happened to. The guy with no nuclear weapons, he was killed by being sodomized with a stick over a car. So the Iranians may decide, gee, I guess we have no choice. If we're under attack, maybe we have to develop nuclear weapons at this point. But as of right now, the official intelligence estimates for every country are that Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon, and they are laying us into a war once again. This war is about regime change, because what they want is a government that is entirely under the control of Israel. Just like when they couped out the elected leader, Mohammed Morsi of Egypt, and put in this brutal general, Mohammed al-Sisi, who was an American tool. He was a CIA asset. He went to the Army, I believe it was the Army War College. That's where he was recruited into the CIA. And he now he rules with an iron fist on behalf of Israel. The Syrian government was broken, and now the new leader of Syria, who was Al-Qaeda, Israel's got no problem with them. They fly over Syrian airspace. They've taken over a third of Israel's occupied about a third of its Syrian territory permanently too. There's no issue. Like the idea is we need another puppet. We need Iran to be a puppet. I don't see that happening. I think this is a dangerous time for America because thousands of Americans are going to die, just as thousands of Americans died in the Iraq War. And the Iraq, keep in mind, Iraq is territorially, it's 1/3 the size of Iran, and it's got half the population. So you're taking on a country that is more technologically advanced, more populous, with more places to hide. There's no way that the United States can invade Iran and have a positive outcome. The Israel has demanded, literally demanded. This is Bibi Netanyahu. When I say Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, specifically the prime minister, has demanded the only solution is the Libyan solution. In other words, regime change, getting sodomized to death with a new leader. And of course, what happened with Libya? Libya is right now a failed state, warlords everywhere, open slave markets. It is destroyed. And this is what Bibi Netanyahu wants. This is his final regime change war. All right, I've gone on a little bit longer than I already intended to. I'll have to do a little thing on immigration some other time. But this is what you can expect from me. Now, again, I'm going to focus on economics. And I will once again, probably for the last time, I don't know, but one of the last times, I'm not going to push contributions, but man, I can do a lot with a little. All right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this. I put together this AI song, and I'm going to probably do it every week with silly lyrics, and it's just a rock song that, this one is with a link to my Buy Me a Coffee, and I'll put any of my patrons or donors on the list at the end of the show, at least for the time being, and we'll go from there. But this is the plan for my podcast. I hope you listen. I hope you share it. And thank you for listening.